You are now listening to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. All right, guys, it is time for another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. Today, I'm going to sit down with my good friend, Dr. Matthew Barber. He worked in Christian higher ed for many, many years, got his PhD while he was working in Christian higher education, and I went to a Christian university that closed just a couple of years ago. And so we're going to talk about the future of Christian higher education today, some of the problems associated with Christian higher education, how it can be successful in the future. We're going to talk about things like academic control, business, economics, all of that kind of good stuff. So a lot of great content from both a Christian and a libertarian perspective today. I think you guys are really going to enjoy this very first ever interview episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. So I'm not going to waste any more time. Here is our interview with Dr. Matthew Barber. All right, Dr. Matthew Barber, thank you for joining the Protestant Libertarian Podcast today.
Hey, good to be here.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So, as you said, my name is Matt Barber. So I live in Independence, Kentucky, married to a wonderful wife, Chastity. I've got two sons, Titus and Tatum. And, currently I'm working for a supply chain organization, but I just exited a job as an assistant dean of a business school.
Okay, cool. Well, and that's why we brought you on the talk today. We are talking about the future of Christian higher education today. I went to a Christian school for my undergraduate degree, and you have a lot of experience working in Christian higher ed. And one of the reasons why we're talking about it on the Protestant Libertarian Podcast is because the libertarian dream of education is to have kind of a stateless education. So there are a lot of kind of like liberty-oriented people that want to send their kids to schools that reinforce their values. And you went to a school or you taught at a school that did that. So how did you begin working in higher education?
So I was actually working in hospital administration, but then funny enough, I went on a mission trip with an executive at this university. We struck up a kind of a friendship, and then I kind of told him a little bit about my background. And, he asked me to apply to an open position. I did. It was a lot more than what I was currently making. So I took the position, and then for the next 10 years, I worked in various aspects of Christian higher ed. So I started out as an administrator. I was a director. And then, from there, moved into a full-time faculty role, and then, kind of went into the administration route again, with the assistant dean, program chair, stuff like that.
Yeah, and so you wound up getting your PhD from the institution you were
Correct.
working at. What was the PhD process like, being there, like working there and also working on getting your doctorate?
So I would say the PhD process as a whole was probably the most influential part of my life, but also probably one of the most difficult, which I've heard a lot of people kind of describe it that. But I would describe it as very transformational. So, obviously, or I guess for most people, the PhD, you've already got some degrees under your belt. By far, the PhD program was the most rigorous, and also probably, again, the word that I like to use is transformational, in that, it changed the way that I view the world and also how I approach problems. So very beneficial, taught me a lot about resiliency and perseverance. And, I guess, as far as like the going to the university I was working at, there was some political stuff going on there, but I think that's probably the case of anybody who goes to the same school that they're working at. So
yeah, and explain a little bit more what you got your PhD in, because I think it ties into kind of the questions that we're talking about on the show today.
Yeah, so my PhD is in organizational leadership, and it's basically, I guess, what I would say is, and we can talk about this more, but, whenever I say I have a PhD in organizational leadership, really what I'm an expert in is governance theory, which is what my dissertation was on. Governance theory is basically the motivations that people have to work for the organization they have, whether are they seeking self-interest or are they seeking the interest of the organization, and then really how can you align those?
Okay, yeah, so just in other words, trying to get people to buy into whatever it is that the institution is trying to do.
Yeah, so the idea is that some people are intrinsically motivated to pursue the mission of the organization. So for example, if you work for a Christian organization and you're a Christian, then you're intrinsically motivated maybe to achieve that mission because your values align. The opposite of that is that if you have someone who's self-interested, and it's really important when I say self-interested that's not necessarily a negative term. What that means is that their primary purpose is to fulfill their self-interest. Well, what you need to do then is align their interests with the organization through, monetary or social measures. And then you can have someone who might be very capable working for your organization and trying to achieve the organization's mission. You just have to align those interests before you kind of start hiring them, basically.
Right. Now, at the Christian institution that you work for, did they, now, were you allowed to teach there if you were not a Christian, or did they have a profession of faith?
No, yeah. So, so every Christian, Christian universities are kind of, they vary. Okay. So most always Christian organizations or Christian universities are owned by a certain denomination. And so that denomination often will set the rules as to whether or not a person can be a Christian, or, maybe they're not a Christian. And you'll actually see a lot of examples of that. So you'll have a very traditional school. Maybe they come from a denomination that holds more traditional values. It's more likely that they will restrict hiring to people who live and believe in the same values as they do. Whereas you'll have other denominations that are maybe a little less traditional, maybe a little more liberal, who, they might just hire someone because they're qualified to teach the subject.
Right. And it all just depends on what the denominational leaders think should happen at their institution.
Correct. And it's a huge spectrum. And a lot of times, there's an article that kind of talked about how whenever a university launches, there's usually a 200-year time period where they're going to have to make the decision as to whether or not to hold to their denominational values, or they'll transfer into just like somewhat of a secular value.
Right. Well, it'd be kind of like Harvard and Yale and
Correct.
Schools like
Absolutely.
that.
Yeah. So ultimately, they have to make the choice whether or not they're going to basically change with the culture, or if they're going to hold true to what they believe is true. And ultimately, that really determines how long the university survives.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And one of the other things too, like along with that, now for the students that came to your school. Now, when I went to Cincinnati Christian University, which doesn't exist anymore, and hopefully we'll talk about that here in a little bit, but they made us all sign like an ethics contract when we got there, which I broke repeatedly while I was at the school.
Good for you.
Yeah. But now, was your institution the same way? Did they have some sort of like ethics contract for the kids, or some sort of spiritual contract for the students that went there?
Well, so this is something that I'm glad you brought that up, because I kind of want to talk about two different segments of both higher education and Christian education. And that is, on campus, like traditional higher education, and then that's it's called different things. It can be called non-traditional. It can be called adult ed, online. So there's really two different markets out there. And so I would say, so for the university that I worked for, if you were an on-campus student, meaning that you lived on campus at the university, you're probably between the ages of 18 and 23, then yes, you had to sign kind of a commitment to it was called a lifestyle agreement. Yeah. And then if you basically didn't follow those rules, you could be expelled from the school. Yeah. But for adult students, there was it didn't matter. You could be Muslim, for example, and be a student. No qualms about that. So really, from the adult standpoint or the online standpoint, we took it upon ourselves to be a Christian university, and that we delivered Christian-based education. The professors were all practicing Christians, devotionals within the classroom, stuff like that.
Yeah, and that, I guess, going back to kind of the governance theory thing too, that kind of, I guess, helped draw people to the organization. And they felt like that would give the students that went there more of a, especially students that came from a Christian background, that would give them more of a buy-in to come to that institution.
Absolutely. So that was one of the draws to be a professor at within Christian education, is that basically you get to use your faith every day within the classroom, and it's kind of a joke. Mostly because, typically within Christian private education, it pays a lot less than maybe if you were to teach at a state school. But that the running joke at my university was that basically you're doing a ministry,
right?
And a lot of the people who work there, they truly believe that. They believe that the reason they're working in a Christian organization and not working at a UK or something like that is that because they're living out their mission.
Right. I think that's true even in K through 12 schools too, because one of the things that I've noticed as a teacher, I work in the public schools, and obviously public school teachers get paid more than private school teachers, but a lot of people choose to go the private school route because they want to work for a school that explicitly supports their values. Like there are a lot of Catholics in particular that want to go and teach at a Catholic school because they know that they'll be in an environment that relates to those values. Now, I did, at least in my experience, that does sometimes create like ethical problems there too, because again, like the Christian values are great, but like a particular denomination's interpretation of Christian values aren't always best for like setting up an institution for long-term business success, which is something that I know you've talked about. So, I want to kind of talk more generally about some of the challenges facing Christian higher education in particular today, but maybe you could speak to that as you kind of answer that question. Like what is it about maybe the Christian aspect that might make some of these organizations less stable?
Yeah, so I mean, I actually have a lot to say about that. So really, so one of the reasons that Christian universities existed in the first place is that just like any other university, somebody wanted to create a place where people could come and learn about various topics. I mean, basically seek truth, which is like kind of the underlying principle of like all educational places, and they wanted to do that in a Christian format. So they created these Christian universities, and I would say that just 50 years ago, there was a huge market for that. I mean, so like we were living in a Christian society. Stores were closed on Sunday. Right. It was even if you didn't go to church, you kind of understood what was right and wrong based on the society that you lived in, because we're living in a Christian society. There's been a lot of authors who would argue that right now we're living in a post-Christian society, meaning that it's not the norm. Christian values are not necessarily the norm in all parts of the U.S. And so what that means is there's not as many people seeking out specifically a Christian education. And so the market for Christian education there's been a dip, basically. And I think the question that a lot of Christian organizations are going to have to answer is how they can make themselves relevant in the marketplace. Now, a lot of them are still trying to sell. I mean, they're so in business, you're always looking for what's called the competitive advantage. So, what is going to make someone choose your institution over a different institution? Right. For a long time, a lot of institutions, their competitive advantage was that they were Christian, and so we're more Christian than this school, and like our values are higher than this other school. So that is no longer a competitive advantage, or at least the market that's seeking something like that is decreasing. So the question that a lot of Christian schools are going to have to answer is why, how are we still relevant in the marketplace?
Right. Yeah, and that's and I guess going on with that too. So obviously, these Christian institutions are competing with state-funded public
Correct.
schools, and so state public-funded schools can afford to make lots and lots of bad administrative decisions because there's always going to be more taxpayer money, more endowment money that's going to be shoveled into those institutions. So they're propped up even if they're inefficient. Whereas those Christian schools, like you said, I mean, they really rely on that buy-in. And if their entire selling point is, we're a Christian school and we're delivering specifically Christian instruction, if we're living in a world that is not really oriented around those values anymore, people aren't going to be attracted to those schools.
Absolutely. So, I mean, again, if someone is coming from a Christian background and they're looking at which university they're going to attend, previously they might choose a Christian institution that costs more because they want to be basically taught with a Christian framework, a Christian foundation. Now we're kind of in a place where even if you are a Christian, not only are you not necessarily limiting yourself to Christian universities, but you're basically basing your decision off of a few things. Like one, you're thinking of like the school's reputation. You're thinking about, I mean, really what they're looking at is return on investment. How much does education cost? What is this degree going to achieve? Where before, I think it was, we kind of went through that period in society where it was understood for a certain group of that we're going to college. We don't know what we're going to do. Right. We don't know what our major is going to do, but we're going to go to college. Right. So the society is really shifting in the fact that they're looking for that return on investment before they're investing in their education, which is problematic for some institutions.
Right, because I think people are, especially now that money is a lot tighter. Like people have to make a good, like they're going to want to get a return in the long run. You can't just go and get like an arts degree and work at Starbucks forever. That's not sustainable anymore. That makes a lot of sense. So with all of that and those challenges they're facing Christian education, like from a bigger perspective there, like what's the purpose of Christian higher education? Like what do you think the purpose is, and then what do you think? I mean, you've obviously touched on this a little bit. A lot of people have traditionally thought that the purpose of Christian higher education was to send their students to an institution where their values would be reinforced in the classroom. But what's the goal from like the school side? Like what's the point of providing that?
Well, so I think that to answer that question, I have to go back to the two types of education that are really provided, and that's online or on campus. The purpose for on-campus traditional Christian education is it's kind of like really what they're selling is they're selling safety for 18 to 22-year-old students.
Yeah, it's like youth group, but
well,
until you're an adult.
And so I know a number of Christian universities that where their selling point is they bring you on campus and they basically try to make it seem like, hey, this is like a 9-month long teen camp. Yeah, so they're like, you're gonna have teen camp for 9 months, and that's what every day is going to be like. And then from a parent's perspective, really parents are usually very involved in like the choice that students make on to where they go to school. They're looking for safety. They're going to send their 18-year-old son or daughter off to a place, and they want to make sure that they're going to be looked after. So they're looking for places that have security everywhere. There's curfews, and there's a lot of regulation. We talk about the lifestyle agreement, no co-ed dorms, things like that. For non-traditional education, the selling point for non-traditional or online education is the ability to kind of have this education while you're doing something else. So there's not very many students who choose to go online, maybe post-COVID. But traditionally, there's not a lot of people who choose to go to online education if that's the only thing they're going to focus on.
Right.
So typically people who are doing online education, they already have a full-time job. Typically, they may have kids. And so really what you're talking about there is you're selling education, but also you're selling convenience.
Yeah.
So for a traditional age student, 18 to 22, as far as priority list, priority number one might be, okay, I need to focus on my studies. For an adult student or for someone who's in online education, first, let's, give the Christian answer and say first is God, and then like family, and then like, let's say your job.
Right.
And then like fourth on the list is education. Right. So really, if you're in the adult or online market, you're selling convenience.
Right. Do you feel like some of that too for these Christian institutions is they're going to use the online platform to kind of like make money because they can reach out to a lot of people and then use that money to invest in the more spiritual side of education?
Yeah. So I'm glad you brought that up and that I didn't have to. So basically, there's a huge margin in online education and I'm not saying I wouldn't go as far as to say that online education was created to be a cash cow for the traditional campus. But as the traditional campuses across America have kind of suffered from the change in market preferences, online education has kind of become the cash cow for a lot of these Christian institutions. And if you look across like the last 5 years, especially COVID, it's been the schools that have a very strong online foundation that have been able to kind of weather the storm because basically they have that kind of I don't want to call it secondary income, but in a lot of ways that income has been what's been able to keep them afloat.
Right.
Well, so and there's a stigma with online or non-traditional education. For example, like if you were to talk to the staunchy academic that teaches at an Ivy League school. Not so much anymore, but 10 years ago, if you were to talk to them about online education, they, immediately they would scoff. They would say, like, is that really
If
education?
You go to University of Phoenix, you basically just have a high school degree.
Exactly. Yeah. Like they, very, very low opinion of online education. That's really somewhat kind of changed, especially with COVID. Even Harvard has online classes now.
Right.
So that's changed. But ultimately you're right. So the margin for online classes is so much larger than brick and mortar institutions that it really has helped financially for universities.
Do you think that's the future then? For not just for Christian higher ed, but for higher ed in general?
Absolutely. So I think that's so. Again, to say it again, COVID has really helped with this because schools that were perfect example. I have no affiliation with the University of Kentucky. Never worked there. Yeah. But I would say that 5 years ago, I had a conversation with someone who worked at the University of Kentucky at a conference, very opposed to online education. Kind of like what I described. They scoffed at the idea of offering online ed. Here comes COVID. It's a pandemic. Now they're going to have, at least 9 months where they're not able to meet on site. Well, now all of a sudden online's your only option. Now so they get into online and they realize, just like all the other, Christian universities have been doing this for years, that while the margin in online education is enormous. And also, not only that, is that, once you get into online education, you realize that the qualities can actually be quite high. We're still setting learning objectives. You're sure ensuring that those learning objectives are met. They're accrediting organizations have accredited thousands of online education or online institutions. So once they kind of all the myths and the stereotypes are kind of dispelled, I think it's only begun really with the large state schools moving to online.
Yeah, and I think too, like there was kind of there, so Cincinnati Christian University went under in I think 2021 or maybe at the very end of 2020, and a part of that was because of COVID, but a part of it was because there had been like kind of this bubble where the government gave people these student loans and incredibly low interest rates, and so it made it seem like they could invest a lot in their future, and so people would go to these overpriced schools. So one of the problems that happened at CCU is that they like invested in like buildings and all of these things, and they continued to draw people in, but as they raised tuition more and more and more, people were starting to be like, unless you really wanted your kid to get a Christian education, you weren't going to send them there, and so they were already losing numbers, and then you have some sort of cataclysmic event like COVID happen, and it just pushes these institutions over the edge. So I think from that perspective, had like CCU been able to like adjust to the market earlier and switch to more of an online platform, that they might actually still be around today. Do you think that like that move to online education is a positive thing for higher ed, or do you think it's an inevitable part of like larger social changes?
So I don't know if I would assign like a good or bad to it. I would just basically say that it's just what's coming. So one of the things that I would say is that online convenience online education, you cannot argue against the convenience of it. So, for example, even if you're an 18 to 22-year-old person, you have other things that you maybe want to accomplish. So, for example, I think this podcast would probably go over if we got it like talking about student loans.
Yeah, we can go as long as you want. A lot of people are interested in that.
But whenever one of the phenomenons that's happened, especially in the last I said 5 to 10 years, is that the reason that there's kind of a reluctancy to take on student loans because you have 18 to 20-year-old students who realize that their parents are still paying off student loans.
Right.
And one of the things that both their parents have said and that they have said is that I will never take a student loan, and that's really growing in popularity. So basically, what's happening there is that people are choosing either A, to not go to college, or if they go to college, they're like, okay, I'm going to go to college, but I'm going to pay for it while I'm in.
Right.
And so what that means is that what they might their experience in college may begin as a full-time worker, part-time student, which would basically lend very well to the online world.
Right.
And they can still go to whatever university they like. I mean, so if you're looking for a prestigious university, chances are they're going to have an online option for you.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's only going to continue, especially as people become more and more wary of student loans.
Right. Well, and that was I did my graduate degree. I got my graduate degree in teaching at NKU, and it was a hybrid program. It was like half online, half in person, and I did that because I was working full time, had a family, and I said that was the best way for me to do it. I could have done the same program at UK, but it would have cost me like twice as much as it did at NKU. And so I went with a school that I could afford to pay for along the way, instead of, having that degree from a, quote unquote prestigious institution like the University of Kentucky when it was all said and done.
Yeah. I mean, I think that what you did there is whether you intentionally or consciously did it, is you basically were thinking about return on investment in the very beginning. Now, I would say that there's an argument for prestigious schools. Like, for example, like it really depends on, so you need to ask yourself before you choose where you're going to go to school and before you're going to pay that extra money. What is basically my return on investment? And so a perfect example. So you went to like an NKU where you paid at least half than what you would pay at like UK.
Right.
Which, I mean, the reason that UK is expensive is, one, because they have a lot of overhead, meaning they have a lot of buildings.
Yeah.
But also because they're working off that strong brand.
Right.
And then one of the things that prestigious schools sell is they sell kind of this badge of approval. So basically, if you're looking for an employer who, for example, like employer bias is out there, meaning that they're suspicious of some schools. And so what they'll do is they'll only choose school from what would maybe be labeled like a tier 1 in school. And then if you come in with a resume with like a tier 3 school on your resume, it's possible that you might not get that job because you have a tier 3 school on your resume.
Yeah.
But that can be mediated by basically your experience and then other things that you've done to basically show that listen, I'm going to be a really good employee.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the things things that, like, so my wife works in the private sector for one of Kroger's brokers, and that's one. She has a bachelor's degree, only got it from NKU, but she's working with, and even there are people that are like underneath her at the company that got degrees from prestigious universities. And one of her arguments about going to NKU is like, it's the same thing. I made contacts. I worked hard from the ground up, and that kind of meant more than that top tier school. But you would still say that in some contexts, especially I guess if you don't know anyone in the company or you don't have any prior experience, that does still give you a little bit of a leg up.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that basically what you're dealing with is you're dealing with whether or not the university is known. So I mean, like, I definitely have no issue with NKU. I'm an alum, so that's where I got my bachelor's.
I think
degree.
Everyone in Northern Kentucky went to NKU for at least one semester.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like, but for example, your wife works in Cincinnati, Ohio. So it's like the employer knows NKU. They know that it's a quality organization. So I work for a very large organization. And it's very common for them to only hire from like tier 1 schools. Yeah. And I've seen firsthand, try not to get myself in trouble here. Sometimes it means like tier 1 school means, sometimes a superstar, a rock star. Sometimes it doesn't.
Right.
Sometimes someone can graduate from a very prestigious school and they're really not better, I guess, comparably to someone who did not. So, I mean, I think sometimes it's like a lot of things that can get you a foot in the door, but at the end of the day, you're going to have to work.
Right. Well, that's one of the things too, and I know a lot of libertarians criticize like the kind of the Ivy League of education because it does create a bubble, and a lot of people that go there come from higher socioeconomic classes, and so they have a particular set of values. And in the same way that Christian schools kind of reinforce that Christian cultural bubble for the students that go there, one of the benefits of sending your kids to like an Ivy League school is that it reinforces kind of that upper class bubble there as well. So do you see that as being kind of like so I guess what I want to ask about that is how does that translate then to real world experience? Because I know a lot of people that I went to college with at CCU that had gone to like a Christian private school or been homeschooled. They went to CCU and then they went out into the quote unquote real world and they couldn't function because they didn't know how to interact with people that didn't share their values. Do you feel like that can happen at the Ivy League level too, or?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the way that it usually, we would have this a lot when I was working within higher education is that we would have students who would graduate, whether it be from a bachelor's degree or like, an MBA or something like that. And they'd come back to us and say like, oh, listen, like I can't get a job, I didn't get promoted or whatever. And typically the way that I would describe to people is that higher education is just like anything else where it's a tool. Right. And so I would really kind of describe it like, let's say that like, you getting this degree is almost like you receiving a hammer. It's on you to use that hammer. If you don't really have the soft skills that kind of support your ability to work, like in whatever field that you're going after, it doesn't really matter if you have that tool. It's not going to really help you as much. So there might be some further development that you need. Now, let's say you're going to a tier 1 school and you've got like a shinier hammer than somebody else. At the end of the day, employers are looking for people who can work and that they can basically achieve organizational goals and objectives. So even though having a prestigious degree might get your foot in the door, at the end of the day, they're looking at producing. I mean, like you might get a job because of where you went to school, but you're not going to keep a job because of where you went to school.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And again, I do feel like there are a lot of people that think they can just ride off their dad's big name forever, and it just doesn't work, especially in a super competitive market where businesses need to see like results from that as well.
I mean, at the end of the day, so especially in a market economy, so like organizations are results oriented, meaning that if you're proven to deliver results, you're going to promote, you're going to be successful. Something like things that basically will help you get a job. I mean, that's exactly what it does. It helps you get a job. And then also, what you learned within your degree program hopefully helps you in your job. Right. But ultimately, it's what you're able to produce that's going to dictate how successful you are.
Right. And if you have the work ethic to stick it out
Correct.
Once you get there.
Yes.
Well, that's kind of a really good segue into what I want to talk about next. So obviously, higher education is extremely politicized today.
Yes.
And that's something that's very prominent in the news. And a lot of libertarians, again, are very critical of that. And it's why people want to, send their children to institutions that reinforce their values again. Did you see any of that politicization in Christian higher education? Because when and just to kind of put this in context, so I graduated in 2012 from Cincinnati Christian University before the Trump administration made it impossible for people to think about politics one way or the other. And I remember like at my school, obviously it was a Restoration Movement school, so traditionally kind of middle of the road. And so I had some professors that were, kind of conservative, and we talked about that in class. And I had some professors that were kind of liberal or progressive, and they talked about that in class as well. But it didn't seem like they were very extreme. Whereas like what it seems like, from my perspective now, what's coming out of the universities are very extreme political positions that kind of affect the way that the institutions function. Did you see any of that in the Christian higher education world? How did the culture wars kind of impact that?
So I wouldn't say so much on political issues, except for political issues that have like moral implications. So a great example would be like, I'll just use, abortion as an example. So because, the denomination that I worked for, had a very firm stance against abortion, you were not allowed to work at the university if you were pro-choice. And so what that would mean then is that not only are you not allowed to work there, but you were not allowed to like promote like a pro-choice I guess behavior within the classroom, promote pro-choice, kind of just like with your students. I mean, that would be very much frowned upon. But I mean, even that's one thing. But really, even like the institution I worked for, you weren't allowed to even consume alcohol. So that also meant that you weren't allowed to do like group projects. Like let's say we're going to do a group project where we're going to improve the return on investment at Jim Beam Distillery or whatever. So I mean, that's kind of more of what I saw there. Probably the biggest thing that Christian organizations are facing today is to how to deal with the
LGBTQ.
Yeah. So listen, I promise I know the acronym. Right. I got nervous because I'm on a podcast.
Well, and they're adding lots of numbers and letters to it every day, so it's hard to keep up.
Yeah, right. So I mean, I think that's probably where the most tension, where they feel the most tension, is that right. So especially with Christian denominations having a very firm stance on their belief, it's not so much that they would prohibit someone who identifies as an LGBTQ plus. There, I got it. Like, yeah, so, you got so it. It's not that they would prohibit them from going to the university. It's that they, basically that person would not be able to necessarily live out, their, I guess, identified sexuality, maybe in the way that they want. And that's probably the largest tension that Christian schools are probably experiencing today, is how to basically navigate that world.
Yeah, and which is crazy because, again, like 10 years ago when I graduated from undergrad, that was on the radar, but that wasn't at all like an issue. It was just accepted if you were a Christian institution that you could have a firm stance on that issue, and it wasn't really controversial then like it is now. Did at your institution, did they have like other like kind of sexual ethic, like what were some of the ethical codes that they required staff and students to abide by when they were there? So
that's actually where that would come into play. So if you were to sign that lifestyle agreement either as a student or as a faculty member, administrator, etc. So I mean, some of the common things, like, so for example, like no premarital sex, no alcohol, no drugs. There were probably, just to be real honest with you, I think I probably skimmed over it once whenever I got hired. But other than that, I don't think I read the document more than once. But that's really where that comes into effect. Is like, so where if you're living on the traditional campus and you identify, let's say that you identify as a gay male, then because the church would not recognize gay marriage or something like that, then that person would not be able to basically have like a sexual relationship on campus. And so the thing is that if a heterosexual person was to have a sexual relationship on campus, they too would also get in trouble. I mean, so it's not
so it was consistent.
Absolutely, there. Yeah. So I mean, so really the law, the logic that they're following is that they're really not discriminating against one group or another. They're basically following the same rule, but whenever you do it within a protected class, sometimes you can get a little sticky.
Right. Well, and that was always my frustration, and kind of still is with a lot of Christian organizations, is that they will excuse they'll excuse kind of heterosexual sexual impropriety,
Correct.
but they won't excuse it for someone who's part of the LGBTQ community. Which I think is a giant double standard. I think we have to be consistent on that all the way through.
Yeah, and I want to be really clear here that one of the reasons that that's a big concern for universities, not that it's obviously they deal with that social issue every day, but one of the things that they're really worried about is that even though I kind of mentioned the steering away from student loans is by far still the number one means for students to go to a traditional university, and there's a worry out there that if you don't allow for LGBTQ plus members to have the rights they feel are due to them, that Christian or private institutions could lose federal funding because student loans are federally backed, and so if that happens, so if there was a federal mandate that Christian institutions were to basically not discriminate, is the way they would phrase it, then at that point, Christian organizations would have to make a decision as to whether or not they're going to die on that hill, or if they're going to say, listen, we need student loans, we're going to have to bend here.
Right. Yeah. So what do you think the right approach for those schools would be?
So I don't know. I have a personal opinion about it. So ultimately, the reason it's going to be very difficult is that, so again, these institutions are backed by a certain denomination. And so the denomination has a manual, they have a ruling as to what they should do there. It's going to be very difficult for them. For me, personally, I think that the less you restrict the educational environment, I think the more learning can occur. So I would actually kind of be in favor of decreasing limitations, personal limitations on students and faculty members. Not to say that I'm not saying that there isn't like a right or wrong. What I'm saying is that whenever you stifle anyone's opinion in any way, you are then not able to have that conversation. Right. And so I would kind of lean towards decreasing, I guess, stipulations and stuff that would maybe hinder creativity.
Right. So people can actually share others, like the opinions of others, and actually share their ideas and have kind of a conversation instead of just forcing people into kind of one lane.
Well, absolutely. And I think this might go back to, personal opinion. But I think that whenever you have a hard stance against something, rather than having a conversation about that, you instead cause people to hide. Yeah. So instead of talking about maybe the dangers of drinking, you just say, well, drinking's not allowed. Well, now everyone's just going to do it in secret. Right. Or I guess, okay. Right. Well,
yeah.
No, did I just incriminate myself? No. But I think what happens is instead of having an honest conversation about it, you basically create an environment where it has to be done in secret, which doesn't learning doesn't occur there.
Yeah, I completely agree. And then the same thing too with these Christian institutions. Like these kids are 18 years old, they're adults. Like they have to be able to make some decisions on their own. Like at some point the church cannot hold their hand. Like they're going to have to either make this decision themselves out of goodwill, or they'll do what they think is right. Like you can only force someone down that road for so long.
And that's actually an argument. Some argument. I think there are some benefits of basically, I would call it like a soft launch, meaning I think there are some benefits of sending your child off to an institution that has things like a curfew and stuff like that. But the other argument that you would have to ask yourself is that really preparing them for the real world? Because at some point they're going to leave that university setting, and the question is whether or not they're going to be prepared to basically live as a functioning adult after kind of a sheltered university experience.
Right. And one of the things that I've noticed too about a lot of the people that I graduated with is that they were in that Christian bubble for a long time, and they left and they realized that there were a lot of, like, alcohol is a really good example. So at Cincinnati Christian University, it was in the ethics code that we weren't allowed to drink. Now, I waited because of my theological values until I was 21, but I still drank while I was a student at that school. So that was what I meant when I said I violated the ethics and things like that. But they kind of grew up in this world where they believed that alcohol, for instance, was necessarily a moral evil. And then when they get out in the real world and they meet people at their jobs that just drink and it's normal for them, then they start drinking, and that gets them to think, well, if my institution was wrong about this, maybe they were wrong about a lot of the theological values. And so a lot of the people that I went to school with have either completely liberalized their faith, like they still believe in Jesus, but he's just kind of back there in the corner, or they've abandoned Christianity in general because they associate Christianity and their Christian upbringing with kind of that stifling moral environment, which it doesn't necessarily reflect true biblical values. Does that
Absolutely.
make sense?
Yeah, I would completely agree. So I mean, so it's kind of the difference again, like to we're like learning about. So drinking is just like anything else. It's a personal choice, and I think that people should make that choice based on an educated process, meaning that you've had a conversation about it, you've observed others around you, maybe that you've probably seen good examples, you've seen bad examples. But if you were just to come off and say, drinking, equals bad, then the problem with that is that you haven't really come to a personal conclusion on that yourself. So basically, you leave an institution maybe that like prohibited you from even really thinking about alcohol. You realize, okay, well, maybe alcohol isn't bad in every sense. And so kind of like you said, now you're like, you don't really know what's up, what's down, what is real. And I think that is a challenge. And alcohol is not the only issue. You could probably like actually throw that across the spectrum with a whole bunch of different topics.
Yeah, absolutely everything. And again, I feel like that in those kind of environments too, it makes it hard for Christian kids to learn how to think for themselves.
Correct.
Like it's kind of like what you were alluding to before. Like there's a certain point where you're going to have to go out and no one's going to tell you to go to bed at 10 o'clock. If you got to work the next day, you just got to figure out how to do that on your own.
Right.
And so I think that by building that bubble up, it kind of distorts those kids' expectations of reality. And that might make it actually harder for them to succeed in the long run.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with that too, kind of as we move on here, I just wanted to, as we get towards the end here, what explains the success of religious institutions like BYU or like Liberty? So, and I know BYU is Mormon, so whatever you want to say about that,
Yeah.
I love my Mormon listeners too. You guys are great, but like I know BYU is Mormon, but with Liberty and BYU seem to be doing a really good job. Their brand is like nationally known. What makes those like religious or Christian institutions successful where other ones like Cincinnati Christian University failed?
So I'll use Liberty as an example because I'm not as familiar with BYU, maybe just because of geographic location. Just haven't met too many people.
Yeah, Utah's a long way away.
Right, yeah. But I do know a lot about Liberty. So Liberty, one of the things that have helped them be successful is that again, kind of going back to like the whole reason that universities exist. A lot of people created universities because there's this like desire to teach, there's desire to impart knowledge, to develop the next generation. A lot of really good intrinsic desires to better society through education. Well, that's really good, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But whenever you're doing something like that, and you're a nonprofit organization, any nonprofit organization, the reason why you exist is that there's a community benefit. And but with community benefit, there has to be a margin. No nonprofit organization works with a negative margin. Yeah. I mean, essentially, you're going to lose money to the point where you have to go out of business. Right. So in order to stay in business, you have to have a margin which supports the mission. Now, what schools like Liberty have done is that they've realized that while we are an educational institution, we are trying to develop the next generation, we are trying to give people education, we also have to understand that there's a market. Yeah. We have to create a product that the market enjoys, they like. We have to price it in a way that we're going to be competitive against our competitors. So just kind of going back, and this is an opinion, so I've never been a student at Liberty, but I have, dealt with them a lot, I guess, which was just peers and stuff like that. Right. I kind of talked about before how online education, the competitive advantage that people will usually use is either price point or convenience. One of the things that Liberty has done is they've made their customer service, which is a term that you don't usually hear in higher education. So if you're going to Harvard, which obviously Harvard is a prestigious school, so they don't need to be offended. Right. But they probably don't talk about customer service very much. Right. I can guarantee you that Liberty has a very strong focus on customer service, meaning that if a student has an issue with the online classroom, with a professor, with their learning management system, if they complain about that issue, it is probably addressed immediately. And so because they've done that, so they've created an environment where there's customer service or customer satisfaction is high. They're offering degrees that are desired within the marketplace. They're priced at a point, and they're actually this is actually one of the reasons I know a lot about Liberty is that one of the things that we would do is at the university I used to work for is that we would realize a market need. So there's a need in the marketplace, and we realized that that we had to our launch to market had to be within a certain number of months. because once Liberty realized that need was in the marketplace, they were going to beat us to market.
Competitor, yeah.
Yeah. So, and the thing is that not a lot of universities have that mindset. They might have a professor who, for example, I kind of talked about how I'm passionate about governance theory. Just because I'm passionate about governance theory doesn't mean there should be a degree in governance theory. Right. The question is there a desire within the marketplace for that degree?
Right.
Are students who complete that degree going to realize a return on investment once they've completed that degree? So Liberty has done a really good job of, one, identifying the needs within the marketplace. They're very quick to market. They have great customer service. They are able to have a price point that basically pushes everyone out of the
right.
the market.
Yeah.
And then one of the things I've really been impressed with them, not to kind of fanboy on Liberty here.
They need to pay us for this episode.
That's right.
We need some royalties here.
But one of the things that they're doing that I'm very impressed with is that they're reinvesting a lot of their money into athletics, which is essentially a higher education marketing. So the only purpose for universities to have strong sport programs is for marketing. Like, I've never been to Alabama, but I know a whole lot about Alabama because they're really good at college football.
Right.
Well, Liberty was, a small Christian school, got a lot of notoriety because they were once led by Jerry Falwell, but but ultimately, the reason that people are hearing about Liberty now that are not a part of the Christian, population is because, I think they might have made the NCAA tournament last year.
Yeah.
They were nationally ranked. NCAA won football last year.
Yeah, I mean they went bowling and football.
Yeah, so they're reinvesting their money as a business should in marketing.
Yeah.
And they're doing a great job at it. So basically, I guess to sum that up and to get off of Liberty's fan page is that really Christian organizations need to understand that they exist within the marketplace.
Right.
They need to realize that there's needs within the market, and they need to seek those needs with a margin. They're going to have loss centers, like, for example, I don't think anyone's making money on a social work program, but they need to understand that along with those community benefit programs like social work, they need to also offer programs that are going to be beneficial or basically money makers.
Right.
And so I mean that would be my advice for Christian organizations.
Yeah, well, and that's it. I'm a Christian capitalist, obviously, and capitalism is a dirty word, mostly because I think that people don't understand what it actually means. But really, all the capitalism is private system of owning the means of production, kind of a market-driven, decentralized way of promoting your business. And there are a lot of Christians that have these high ideals that any sort of institutions that are connected to the church shouldn't be about making money, and it shouldn't be about market principles. But at the end of the day, if you're not financially responsible, if you don't run your organization or your church with good, solid business principles, you're not going to be able to survive. And you think that's kind of what leads to the death of a lot of these smaller Christian organizations. So
absolutely. I mean, so just like you said, I think that a lot of people who hear the word nonprofit, I think this is especially true in both churches and Christian universities, is they hear the word profit or margin and they think it's a dirty word.
Right.
But in reality, I mean, just like any other organization, you need a margin in order to complete your mission.
Right. And
the more margin you have, the better capability you have to accomplish that mission. Now, I mean, there needs to be checks and balances in place. But this is especially true. I mean, I think that universities should probably take a note from the hospital playbook. So hospitals will have millions and millions and millions of dollars in surplus. And they're nonprofit organizations, and some people will see that and they'll be like, "Oh my goodness, that's terrible." Well, no, all that money is reinvested into the hospital to be a better hospital. So now that hospital is going to improve because they basically priced themselves in a way. They assessed the market. They knew this is what. Now let's not get into healthcare because that could be. But
yeah, we could do a whole other episode on that. No,
but another great example and very good. And I'm going to get. I'm not going to give out my email address because I'm going to get hate mail for this. But another great example of a nonprofit organization who does an excellent job of making margin is Goodwill. Yeah, and so people hear about how much the CEO of Goodwill makes, and they're like, "Oh my goodness, how could they do that?" No, boycott Goodwill. Basically, if the CEO is making this much money and they have this much margin, then they must not be they must not be a wholesome company. But ultimately, what they're doing is that they're good. They're successful within their market. They are, because they're a nonprofit organization, they are mandated to reinvest all that money into the organization, and they chose a CEO who's able to lead a nationwide, humongous organization. So, I mean, I guess, again, that's just my personal thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, but they provide people with the service that people want. Like, there's a Goodwill a half a mile down the road from my house, and I take my crap up there all the time, and I give it to them, and
yes.
that helps at no cost to me.
Yes.
They give me an opportunity to clean out my house.
Absolutely.
Another problem with that too is I think that a lot of people confuse they confuse wealth with income, and so
yes.
like they look at like Jeff Bezos of Amazon, for instance, is worth like $60 billion, right? But if Jeff Bezos woke up tomorrow and decided he was going to sell Amazon, the majority of his net worth, his wealth, is tied up into his company. Like
yes.
he's taking that wealth and reinvesting it into new factories and new capital equipment and to hire new workers and things like that. So if he sells Amazon, he's still probably going to walk away with $2 or $3 billion. Yeah. But the wealth will stay behind with
the
company.
He's not worth $60 million.
Right.
$60 billion.
Right. Yeah. That's exactly right. And I think too, like, the mega churches, for all the crap that those of us that go to smaller churches like to give them, like a lot of those mega churches are successful, not because they've compromised their theological values, but because they're really good at managing their money and then pumping that back into organizational efforts in the community that draw people in. And so they're able to use kind of those accumulated funds to reinvest in the community. And there are several mega churches in Northern Kentucky that do a lot of really good community work.
Correct.
And you're saying simply that, like, when Christian higher education institutions do that kind of stuff, when they accept the fact that they're in a market and they have to have market-driven business principles, that's kind of the key to success there.
Absolutely. I mean, so I will, I'm not naive enough to not know that there is a dark side.
Right.
I mean, so there are nonprofit organizations out there who make a huge margin, and really what they're just doing is they're doing tax evasion.
Right.
But for the most part, a lot of nonprofit
organizations. Foundation.
What? But I mean, for the most part, a lot of nonprofit organizations, they have a mission that is tied to the community. They're trying to do a community benefit. Whether that's, providing Christian education or providing people with cheap clothes, which is, Goodwill. And so, I think that while it's not obviously not everyone they have good intentions, a lot of the large nonprofit organizations are just very efficient in the way that they run their organization. Right. And one last thing, again, I'll get on the Liberty fan page again.
Yeah, here we go.
So one of the things that they've done that has really helped them is that instead of hiring academics to run the departments, they've hired managers. So just a good example, and this was true 5 years ago. I don't know if it's still true now, but if you were to look up on Liberty's page, then the dean of the business school is a U.S. senator. Now, if you believe that the U.S. senator is actually making day-to-day decisions at Liberty University, then you're wrong. Okay, so like obviously he probably doesn't have a lot. So below him is a director. They do not have a doctorate, to my knowledge. Right. But that person is probably a very skilled manager. Right. So what they've done is they're hiring managers to run the business like a business. They're not hiring an academic who maybe does not have the business sense to make business decisions. Yeah,
that's an excellent segue into one of the last questions that I want to ask you here too, because one of the problems that you've alluded to today and that that we've talked about before is that, like, you have these organizations that will put academics, and they might be extremely competent in one area, but they put them in these administrative roles, and just because they're really good at, I don't know, translating ancient Latin text into English, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to know how to run a department. Absolutely. Education. Yeah. So one of the themes that I've come to again and again on this show, and we're going to have some more episodes on this in the coming weeks, is that there are a lot of biblical scholars that are really, really good at kind of understanding and interpreting the Bible and its ancient context. But then when it comes to applying that to like contemporary political and especially economic issues, it's just a complete mess. Like, I very famously attacked one of my favorite scholars, Michael Gorman, on the third episode of my show, because he has all of this great stuff on Revelation, but then he goes off on these tangents about capitalism that have nothing to do at all with what capitalism actually is. Yeah. And so one of the theories that I have about the PhD process, and since you've been down this road, you kind of know what this is like, is that the PhD process is great. And obviously there are a lot of very intelligent people that do that, but you become so hyper specialized in one discipline or in kind of one intellectual discourse that it makes it very difficult for you to speak competently about other issues. But there are a lot of people that have PhDs that feel like just because they have a PhD gives them the right to speak speak about things that they might not necessarily know anything about. Do you want to speak to that? Like what do you the hyper specialization of PhDs?
So I'll approach that in two different ways. So one, I'll approach it as far as like somebody who's hyper specialized within the classroom, and then I'll talk about I think what you're actually asking about, which is a hyper specialized person being in a leadership position. And so I'll use myself as an example because I have a PhD in organizational leadership, and what I would say is so I mean lots of different things coming up here. So first of all, there's different doctoral degrees. So, for example, an MD, meaning that you're a medical doctor, is different, obviously, than somebody who has a PhD, which is a theoretical philosophy degree.
Right.
So when you have a philosophy degree, really what you're doing is you're talking about the theoretical foundations of topics. You get to know something on a theoretical level, and then the hope is the whole purpose of the dissertation process is that you know something so well. Basically we teach someone to conduct research. We teach them to defend the research and the conclusions they've come up with, and that you've taken that theory one step forward. That doesn't necessarily mean that a person who has a PhD in leadership is the best leader in the world. So there's a difference there, right? So I know a lot about governance theory, and so I could probably inform someone on that. That doesn't necessarily mean that because I have a PhD in organizational leadership that I should be running a Fortune 500 company, right? So same issue kind of happens within academia. So let's say that what traditionally happens, and this happens in other industries too, but it happens a lot in academia, is someone does very well in the classroom. So they're very great at knowledge transfer. They get in the classroom, students love them. They're like, well, we should make them the chair of the program. And so they become, which is kind of like the chair is kind of this position to where you're halfway in the classroom and halfway administrative, probably not going to do too much damage. But the reason that you got that job is because like you're basically good in the classroom. And maybe you did exhibit some administrative skill, right? So let's say you do a pretty good job at the program chair role. So now you're promoted to the dean role. Well, again, you might have some administrative skill, but ultimately you got the job because you're really smart, basically. Right. you're an intellectual, right? Well, so just because you have like a strong, I guess, academic pedigree doesn't necessarily mean that you're qualified to lead a large organization. And some really large schools still make this mistake. So a good example, and I'm not saying that Harvard is suffering at all. I'm sure they're doing fine. But I mean, if you look at all their leadership positions, typically the people who are leading their positions are very well respected academics. Yeah. Their president wrote probably one of the best books I've ever read on higher education, understanding the commoditization of higher education. So I mean, like this guy, so he probably does a pretty good job. But ultimately what I'm saying is that if you're choosing someone to be in a leadership role and they're making management business decisions because they have a strong academic pedigree, that might be a recipe for disaster. Right. It might work in the traditional setting where, we kind of talked about the difference where, in traditional campuses, you basically had this like carefree environment where the professor is out on the lawn with the kids and we're teaching them about life. So it might work in that setting, but in a competitive marketplace, you basically need an administrator who understands things like market share, competitive advantage, price point, market need. You need someone who understands things like that in order for your organization to be successful. And unfortunately, a lot of universities put someone who is more academic in the highest spot, so our president. So what that means is that the person who at the end of the day is making, other than the board of directors, but the person at the end of the day who's making the key decisions for the university is not a master of business decisions. They're a master of something, and they probably have some administrative skills, but they're not Jeff Bezos. You know what I'm saying? They're not the one who has this forethought and stuff like that. But again, I mean, that's a personal opinion. I mean, it's probably not universal, so don't take my general comment to mean every university. But by and large, that would be my opinion of the problem with higher education and Christian higher education.
Yeah, well, and that's one of the things that I've noticed too about like Christian organizations in general is that people think that they have these gaps in knowledge that can be filled by prayer and Jesus, basically. Like if I believe in Jesus enough, my organization is going to survive. Well, but maybe Jesus isn't going to help you with that specific goal.
Well, so that's a touchy topic. I don't I don't want to get kicked out of Christian higher ed altogether. But you're absolutely right. So basically, if your organization is struggling, it's never a bad idea to pray. It's also never a bad idea to seek consultants who have very large amount of business knowledge and acumen. So, I mean, I think that sometimes, it kind of reminds me, I read a book one time that, one of the fallacies that we have with prayer is that you believe in genie God, meaning, well, I'll just rub this lamp and the genie will just give me what I need. Yeah. And, I don't want to make too much light of, the power that God has. Obviously, he's in control.
Right, yeah.
But he also gave us, 2 working hands, 2 working feet, and he gave us a mind that is able to make, qualified and wise decisions. And so, what I would say is that...
Oh. There we go. Oh, you know what? Forgot to mute my host. That's going to be fun in the recording. It's the first time I've ever recorded an interview.
I was thinking to myself, man, what a rude way to cut me off.
No, we're doing really good on time, though, here, Matt. All right, perfect. Good. Anyways, yeah.
Yeah, so what I'm saying there is I mean, the Hail Mary, which is literally, kind of fun. I mean, literally, it's a Hail Mary.
It is.
Ultimately, what you need to do is, I'm not saying not to pray. I'm not saying to ask for wisdom in every decision. What I am saying is that after you pray, you should go out and you should seek to find the answer and understand that God is helping you find that right answer.
Right.
That he's not just to have more students attend your school, which is often the prayer.
Yeah, well, I think, going back to what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 12 about, the body being made up of different parts, like God gives different spiritual gifts to different people, and I think like people that are in these Christian organizations need to have the humility to know when they're not competent in something, and they need to find people that can do that well, instead of saying, if I pray enough, then Jesus will love me and this will be successful, and then when it inevitably fails, blaming it on Satan or whatever for the failure, instead of just maybe you not knowing what.
So I've worked for multiple Christian organizations in different capacities, and what I've really seen there is that some of the organizations that begin to struggle, rather than kind of going the route of finding maybe a consultant or somebody who has like the business experience to maybe lead them out of the trouble, I've seen it to where they've doubled down, meaning that we're just going to have hours of prayer meetings. We're going to increase the prayer meetings. Enrollment's going down. Increase the prayer time. And again, I don't want to make light of prayer. I think prayer is very powerful.
Yeah, absolutely.
But also, I think that praying and understanding that God walks with you. I would say that you probably have a better understanding of this than I do. But the verse that talks about praying without ceasing. Yeah. It doesn't mean just to lock yourself in a closet all day and to pray without ceasing. It means that walk with God, meaning that everything you do is essentially you're walking with God in every decision that you make, and that includes business decisions. Meaning that if I need to make a good business decision, I know that I don't have the skills to make that decision. Then I can walk with God and find the right person to make that decision. Right. I don't necessarily need to have another prayer meeting.
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's, kind of like what Paul says in Romans 12, like you're supposed to offer your body as a living sacrifice. It's just a way of going throughout life. And again, like a lot of these organizations fail because they did not have the humility to seek outside help. Yeah. And that was one of the things with CCU. Now, I'm going to this is my show, so I'm going to speculate a little bit. I have some friends that were there up until the very end, and so I found out about what happened to CCU through them. So I haven't read this on any official documents or anything like that. But one of the things that they said is there was another Christian university aligned with the Restoration Movement from Tennessee, Johnson University, and they offered to buy out CCU, and the board basically said no, we got it. And then 3 years later they went under. Because and some of the reasons for that from the people that I've talked to is just the board basically thought that Jesus was going to pull them through because they had some mission in Cincinnati. Correct. And that didn't happen. And that to me is a reflection of how they didn't have the humility that they needed to step back and say, hey, we're in trouble. How can we work through this and let other people come alongside us and help us out? Yeah.
And I'm not going to say that I don't believe in miracles. I believe that miracles have happened in the past and that they, who's to say that there's going to be more miracles that happen, but ultimately I don't think that God's first plan for us is to pray for miracles. Right. I think that he wants us to pray for guidance. I think he wants us to love others, reduce suffering within the world. I don't think God, again, is a genie to where if we have a problem that we can simply, again, read the Bible and pray to him and that all of a sudden, we're going to have an epiphany that's going to solve our business problem. Right. I think that might be a fallacy that a lot of Christians fall into. And I think that, again, if they were to understand that, especially now, not maybe always, but now, that higher education is a marketplace. Customers have choices, and that if you cannot create a competitive advantage, then you really have some serious work to do. So I guess that's kind of where I'm at with that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. There's only one more question I want to ask you.
Yeah.
So you made the transition from Christian higher ed to now working in the secular business world.
Correct.
How was that transition for you? What have been some of the benefits? What are some of the challenges? How has that transition basically been from going to those?
So I mean, it's been good. It's been different. So working in a Christian environment, there's pros and cons. I don't want to say that working in a Christian environment is completely terrible, because it's not. I mean, obviously you work with some pretty nice people if everyone there is a professed Christian. But also it's been fairly freeing. So again, kind of going back to the organization being kind of ran by a denomination, there is pressure to always align yourself with that denomination in order to not basically become a pariah within the organization. So like if you have an idea that might go against the denomination, then you maybe be stifled. You might be stifled, from kind of giving that idea, because it could literally mean your position. If they determine that you're not, I forget the word. It's only been a short amount of time, but mission fit, mission fit.
So quick.
Yeah, mission fit. So
yeah.
if you make a decision that, or if you come from a perspective that might not be mission fit, you could seriously be impacting your employment, especially if they're making layoffs and stuff like that. So, I mean, one of the things that's been freeing is that obviously I don't have that restriction. You're not going to be, exactly who I want to be within this workplace. Another thing is that, and this is just a personal preference or whatever, but it's really hard to be a missionary in a school of missionaries, right? So, it is in the classroom, but the farther removed from the classroom you get, you're not really necessarily ministering to the people around you as much as you are just like, well, how was your day? I guess being in the secular field, as a Christian, I have the ability to, not to be too cheesy, but let my light shine.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah.
So that's been great. And then also another great thing about the secular world is there's no qualms about efficiency. I mean, it's like they're looking for production, they're looking for efficiency, and there's no ideologies that are getting in the way of that. So that can be good and bad. But I mean, I work for an organization who seeks a public good. And so, it's really freeing, I think, to be able to, express ideas and stuff like that and not fear any kind of reprisal. So,
yeah, that's awesome. Well, Dr. Matthew Barber, thank you very much for talking to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Hey, it was a pleasure.
It's good time today.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments or thoughts about the show, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter @ProLibertyPod. Again, you can follow me on Twitter @ProLibertyPod. You can also support the show by leaving a rating or a review on your favorite podcast app. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.